Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
This week's topic is another story pitch from a listener/coworker in the building. First, for some context, our corporate station owner, Nexstar Media Group, hosts a nationwide initiative to honor remarkable women in our local communities, to honor the influence women have on public policy, social progress, and the quality of life. And from that initiative, we get to hear a lot about really neat personal stories, women in our community doing remarkable things in New Mexico. And this week's guest is one of those women who KRQE is honoring for 2025's Remarkable Women Contest.
Yeah, and a big thanks and shout out to Carolyn Rush. She is our Community Relations Director here at KRQE, who really helps coordinate this local New Mexico version of Remarkable Women, the initiative here. And from that, we obviously get to hear some really great stories about people doing important work in the community that, that story may not always get out there to everybody. So we want to share one of those stories here today about some of the work, as this one revolves around a big issue that is certainly here in New Mexico, particularly in Albuquerque, that being human trafficking. So our guest, let's introduce her here, is Shelley Repp with the New Mexico Dream Center. So Shelley, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate that. And it's really an honor to be noted as a remarkable woman.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so we want to start with a little bit of your background, since this is the first time we're having you on here as a guest, and obviously it's part of the process here is just getting to know a little bit more about you. So before you joined the Dream Center and before you became involved with our subject matter here for today, are you from New Mexico? Are you a parent here? Tell me a little bit about your life.
So actually, I moved here as a child. My dad was transferred here. He was part of the National Forest Service, and so he ended up moving here and brought us all along in 1978. And so I feel like a native because I've been here for many, many years, and then all three of my kids were born here and still live in the state of New Mexico.
Okay.
So definitely feel like I belong here.
Yeah, and has it always been the Albuquerque area as well?
Yes, I've always lived in the Albuquerque area, and one of my three children still does live here, but the other two, they've kind of migrated east, and so they actually live in Portales, New Mexico,
Right on.
doing some great work out there.
ENMU, that's where my wife went to college there. So.
That's where they met their husbands.
Yeah. Right on.
Awesome. Well, okay, so the Dream Center, for those who aren't aware, its mission is to, quote, provide a 360 strategic approach to address human trafficking in New Mexico through prevention, outreach to victims, services for survivors, and a support system for clients. But that's from the website. Shelley, tell us, how big of an issue is human trafficking in New Mexico, and when did you become exposed to this problem? We'll sort of take this in layers.
Sure, absolutely. So I think that human trafficking is something that people are just now becoming more aware of. I know for me, myself, I had no idea even what human trafficking was until about 2010. I mean, I had seen the Taken movie, but that was only because I liked Liam Neeson. Right. And so I didn't realize how it would impact our community or what was actually prevalent here in Albuquerque. And I had like an interaction with somebody who ended up being a human trafficking victim that was a trajectory change for me as a person that changed the course of my career and honestly the course of my life.
Can you tell us about that first,
Yes.
when you first became exposed to it?
Yes, absolutely. So I was actually working at a local church here in Albuquerque, and we were doing a lot of community outreach events, and that was what my job was to liaise with the community and other organizations, and what can we do, and how can we be good neighbors. And so we were working with Highland High School, and had talked with the principal back then, and had said, what can we do to support you? And they had said, well, we've got some students that may or may not graduate, and then maybe we can do some kind of support for those students. And we had at that time a really large college group at our church. And I'm like, hey, let's mash that up. Let's get those college kids to hang out with the high school kids and see if we can kind of just help them along. Well, a few weeks into this project, one of those college students came and said, I need you to talk to the girl I'm working with because there's just some stuff that's not right and I don't know what to do about it. And I'm like, sure. I'd been working with families, specifically needy families, for quite a while. And so I I felt kind of used to all of the normal but terrible things in this world. And I felt like I had a lot of good resources. And so I didn't have any anxiety about, setting up this meeting. Well, who walked into my office was a 20-year-old Rwandan refugee who had literally survived the genocide by carrying her siblings on her back across the country to Uganda, where she was placed in a refugee camp. And then they ended up finding a sponsor family here in the Albuquerque area in the International District. And so she and her siblings were placed with this family, and she had started school. They were doing well. And then essentially she was put in a situation where the family was not going to receive any more funding because she had turned 20 and was too old to for the family to receive that funding anymore. And so essentially they said, we can't support you, so you can leave our home, or we have found this white man in Detroit who's willing to pay for you and buy you as a bride. And she was telling me how she didn't want to get married and she didn't know him and she didn't want to move to Detroit. And I remember thinking, I don't think that he can buy you in the United States. Like I didn't have words for what that was, and I didn't understand what was going on. And so that was the door that opened up my life to starting to research what is human trafficking. We did end up reaching out to the Attorney General's office at the time about this issue because we just didn't know who to talk to, and we didn't want this family to end up doing worse things. And so it did get resolved, which is fantastic. But it was that trajectory change where I suddenly had to learn everything I could about human trafficking and what does that look like in the United States and what does that specifically look like in New Mexico. And that was just kind of the roots of what would become New Mexico Dream Center.
So her sponsor family was trafficking her here?
Her sponsor family was trafficking her. And to kind of put it in context, her sponsor family was originally from Africa. So I don't think that they were like, let's see what we can do. Even though I do think there are a lot of traffickers who do that. I think they were saying, we would still like some money to come into our family, and this seems like a good way to do that. But it does open up the fact that familial trafficking by families, is actually one of the largest models of human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, across the United States and here in New Mexico.
Yeah,
Wow.
I think that's what strikes me is that, you had mentioned earlier, I'd seen the movie Taken, and, we get these ideas of what trafficking may look like from whether it's movies or TV shows or just stories we hear. But then you hear something like this and you realize that the issue can take far different shapes than many of the common stories I think that we hear. So.
Absolutely. And I think that when people do think of human trafficking, they refer to these movies or these large media things. And that gives you, again, that one side or a perhaps trafficking can happen like that. But what we see and the reality is actually, in my opinion, much more insidious, and it's much more common, and we just don't see it.
Yeah. I mean, for that girl to be going to school, I'm assuming maybe the school hadn't recognized this, but it was a college student who recognized it. Wow.
Exactly. And I think that the school, and again, so this was back in 2010, and so I don't think that the school had any idea about human trafficking at all. I mean, federally, human trafficking was not even acknowledged until 2004. And so that's when it first came into like federal law and the vernacular around federal legislation. And then in 2008 is when it actually came into New Mexico, where New Mexico code essentially started referring to human trafficking. We had referred to drug trafficking and weapons trafficking, but then human trafficking. And so 2008 is when we saw that change. And so with this being 2010, nobody really knew anything. And so I know for me, when I was at the time trying to figure out what was going on, the only thing that we could find was the Attorney General's office at that time that had knowledge around human trafficking.
Well, you had mentioned this was 2010. I know according to your bio, you started an outreach ministry by the next year, 2011, for women who were working in strip clubs, that outreach ministry being called Spoken For, as I understand.
Correct.
What was that work like? What are some of the stories that you heard around that time?
Absolutely. So in looking back, there's that's kind of a controversial thing because guess what? Strip clubs we know are legal. So it's a legal business, but it is a venue that kind of opens the door for exploitation and specifically into what we would say would be human trafficking. So what we did was, at the time, we had some pretty bold church ladies who were like, hey, let's see if we can make a difference. And we came up with a concept where we would send teams into the strip clubs, and they would bring gifts to just give the dancers. So totally no strings attached, in that they had to do anything other than take these gifts and if you want to have a conversation. So the outreach was built very much in a relationship-based way. Let's talk. Is there anything that you need for support? And in fact, when we had talked to the managers about this at those strip clubs, that's what we said, is we know that this is a hard industry for these women, and so we can help them. And so we didn't have any trouble getting into the strip clubs, and essentially then started talking and working with them. As time went on and they began to trust us, what we started to hear were some pretty sad and scary stories. So we heard of people under the age of 18 who were working as exotic dancers in these clubs. We heard about groups of people. So they would have somebody bring people in specifically to that club as, dancers, and advertised as these special dancers who we would look at and say they were absolutely trafficked. They were brought in by a controller. The controller walked them back to their dressing room, stayed with them the whole time. They only worked in a specific part of the club. And so there were all of these types of things that we would say would point towards trafficking. And what we would then do is we would then talk about with, the people that were there, what can we do to support and help you?
Can you define for people, because you said you didn't know what human trafficking was, can you just define what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So human trafficking is the sale of commercial sex that is enforced through force, fraud, or coercion. So essentially, you're looking at commercial sex, if we're talking about sex trafficking, commercial sex that is produced through the use of force. So you have to do this or I'm going to punch you. Fraud, I'm going to trick you into doing this. Or coercion, I'm going to manipulate you into this. And so that's what we're looking at with human trafficking, with one caveat. And that caveat is an age caveat. And that is, if you are selling sex as somebody who is under the age of 18, you are then considered to be a human trafficking victim, whether there's a controlling factor in that or not. So whether there's a trafficker or something else, if you are under 18 and selling sex, you are considered to be a human trafficking victim, both federally and here in the state of New Mexico, because we are considered a safe harbor state. And I think that's important because we still hear language things where people will say, well, there's this teen prostitute or child prostitutes. And that's not an accurate definition because they are absolutely a human trafficking victim. They're too young to consent to commercial sex, essentially.
Got it. Okay. So eventually you merged that nonprofit, Spoken For, with the original nonprofit, with the Dream Center. It sounds like you were able to combine efforts with others in the community. How does it work now? And what sort of clients do you work with at the Dream Center? How do they find you and vice versa?
Absolutely. So yeah, it was really great because as I had started Spoken For, essentially a good friend of mine had started Dream Center. And so we had supported each other. We started the nonprofits within like 2 months of each other. And so we were kind of already working collaboratively. So it just made more sense because neither of us had any money to just combine forces. And so we brought in Spoken For as that program for providing services for human trafficking victims. And then they were working with the homeless population in a couple of different ways. So what that looks like now is that we have an outreach drop-in center called the Harbor, specifically for unhoused young people, so 21 years old and under, so 14 to 21. We have the Harbor open. It opens today at 2 o'clock, and young people can come for walk-up services, and so they can have a hot meal. They can take away food with them, snacks. We've got showers. We've got a couple washers and dryers, clothing, hygiene, and more importantly, we have some staff that are willing to chat, get to know them, and help connect them to services. And that's really really what we want to do with the harbor. There's, as you all probably know, we would consider a homeless crisis here in the Albuquerque area, and we do across the United States. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that we have a lot of unhoused youth. We've got a lot of young people who are on the streets that have either left maybe from the foster system, or they're preferring the streets to whatever's happening in their homes, and we don't have enough services for these young people. And so we know that as service providers, but you know who really knows that, and where this really meets up with our human trafficking side, are the predatory traffickers that are out there. Because a kid who's on the street can't get food stamps for themselves. They're not going to be able to get a job necessarily for themselves because they don't have an address. They're not likely to have an ID. And so they become super vulnerable, and these traffickers do know that. And so we started the harbor, honestly, because I had 3 young people on my client load who had all been trafficked from being homeless here in Albuquerque. And so we thought we've got to do something different. And so that's where kind of that started with that homeless project.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
Human trafficking certainly is one of those issues that may be out of sight, out of mind for some folks here in the community.
Right.
Can you break down just some of the basics? We did ask for that definition there of what trafficking is, but as well, I think one of the components we haven't talked about as well is who is perpetuating the trafficking.
Right, absolutely. So when you look at these common human trafficking models, and specifically if we're looking at sex trafficking, there's kind of some misinformation around that. So one of the things that I hear a lot is that the majority of the people who are trafficked in the United States are foreign nationals. And it's just not true. There are a lot of foreign nationals that are trafficked, especially with New Mexico being a border state. We do see that, but the overwhelming majority of sex trafficking victims we see are actually domestically born. They're born here in the United States. So that's the first thing to be important, because that means anybody that's here, we need to be aware of that. The other thing is that we hear that the way a young person ends up in a trafficking situation is because they're kidnapped. So maybe they're a runaway, something like that, and then they get kidnapped by this trafficker and they end up as a trafficking victim. And that hardly ever happens. Not that kidnapping doesn't happen, but that's very rarely the way that they end up as a trafficking victim. What we see is traffickers who operate in some very specific models, and there are 4 models that are super common here in New Mexico. And so can I go through those? Because that's kind of explains how the trafficker happens. So the first model we would call a relationship-based model. So when we hear words like pimp, like this is my pimp, that's a trafficker. And so that type of model is built off this concept of grooming. So a person has come into the life of that young person and has groomed them to be willing to listen and follow and do what they ask them to do. And it almost is always based on a romantic relationship. Like, oh man, I'm your knight in shining armor. Let's go build a life together. And then it just, becomes something else.
These are the things that you need that I can provide
Exactly. And where we see that happening a lot now is we see that happening online. So we know that people build relationships and online. That's the most common way, I think, in this modern era. And the danger with that is that trafficker can portray himself to be anyone. And so we see that on social media. There's obviously hookup apps, all sorts of different communication apps. But the scary thing is that we see that happening more and more often with video game chats. So your kid can be chatting with somebody on that video game. You don't know who they are. And it's really easy for that trafficker to then pivot that conversation from the video game chat that maybe the parent's following to downloading something like a coloring book app that has a chat feature. And now I'm going to chat with you there, and your parents aren't aware that that's happening. And so it's really important to understand that, just for basic internet safety. So that's one of the models. We call that kind of romantic relationship-based model. The second one we already talked about a little bit, which is familial trafficking. And for us with New Mexico Dream Center, most of our clients actually have survived familial trafficking. So it is something that is really prevalent here in New Mexico. And that is when children are trafficked by family members. And it can be something like, this is just how this family's DNA is, like they just have always done this, and so grandfathers have always trafficked their grandchildren or aunts or uncles. But it can also be needs-based when families have just really fallen into really difficult times, and usually that's due to substance use. And so the resources of that family are all going into those substances, and so they pivot and they turn to selling their child to be able to create income for that family. And so we see that, and in fact, our victims that we work, that's the case that we're seeing, and that's why it's so important we're addressing homelessness and families that are on the streets here in our local community. But then we do see gang trafficking, and so gangs have, like any other community organization, have to create income, and so they've traditionally created income through the sale of drugs and the sale of arms. But with New Mexico, we do not have great legislation addressing the criminality aspect of trafficking, and so it's actually easier for them to traffic a person who wants to be in that gang anyways than it is for drugs and weapons, because there's a lot of established criminal code around those crimes and not around human trafficking. So we've seen that increase. And then the final one is one we also talked about a little bit, which is homeless youth exploitation. And so these young people that are on our streets that don't have resources or places to go, who end up falling into that trafficking situation or being preyed on by that trafficker. So when you're asking who are the bad guys or these traffickers, they can be a lot of different people depending on what kind of circumstance you might be in.
After working with all these groups, can you point out like who is most at risk for human trafficking in New Mexico? Is it homeless youth? Is it runaway teens?
Well, in looking at it, it's really anybody who has a high ACE score. So ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this is a rating system when a kid has something dangerous happen in their life. The more points on that, the more likely they are to get themselves into vulnerable situations. And so you can have a kid who's absolutely housed, living with their mom and dad, but has this high ACE score that is still very vulnerable to a trafficker. And so in looking at that, I think that's probably the biggest thing to look at. The second thing is that we have to understand that traffickers are looking for people that they're going to perceive as being able to manipulate. And so when you've got, some young kids who are struggling with feeling like they need to fit in, or maybe they're in a family where their socioeconomic status is lower, those are things that can absolutely also contribute to something like this. And so it's a complicated answer. There's not always a really clear line, but the one we look at is that ACE score, because that's almost like this index of vulnerability for somebody.
And who would create the ACE score? Who measures that? Is it doctors? Is it police? Prosecutors?
So you can absolutely do the ACE score online if you want. Like you can right now, or after the show, you can go and do a free ACE score and see what your ACE score is, because it's a series of 10 questions that people can just answer, and you get 1 point for each question. Where we see that administered with kids is in behavioral health facilities. We do see that in some pediatric offices, but it is something that you might want to ask about. It's not something that's an automatic thing, like, okay, you're in 3rd grade, now it's time to take the ACE score test. So
yeah. And you mentioned gaming and also online safety. We've talked about this issue a lot on the podcast with various guests, because it just comes up over and over, I feel like. But is there anything that you would specifically say to parents who just might not be aware of this, maybe for the first time? What would your advice be?
So I would say one of the best things you can do, and this actually kind of helps mitigate an ACE score too, is having really crucial conversations with your kids. Here's the thing. Your kid, they're going to make some bad decisions. We just all need to know that. But we kind of are afraid to lean into some uncomfortable conversations with our kids around sex, around safe relationships. And I think that's one place that you can start is, I think when you give your kid their cell phone, you say, here's what we need to do. Here are the rules for the cell phone. I am going to look at it. You can't download things without my permission. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do as safety precautions. I'm going to have parental controls. But then the next part of that conversation needs to happen. And the reason we're doing this is because there are people online who are going to lie to you, and they're going to pretend to be your boyfriend or your girlfriend, and we need to keep you safe. That's important. So I think having that kind of relationship and talking with your kids is important. That being said, there is some amazing software out there that can kind of enhance parental controls, and it will alert to keywords, it will alert to images, and that's super important for that to be on not just your child's phone, any device that they have, and that you're actually monitoring those types of things.
When it comes to minors living on the streets or someone maybe just without good familial support or good support system, I imagine it can make for a lot of barriers when it comes to just basic needs, right?
Absolutely.
What are the kinds of resources at the Dream Center that you're there offering young folks? We talked a little bit about this earlier, but just to get a little bit more into the work,
absolutely.
What are the kinds of peoples and professions you have on staff? And
Sure. So we do offer those basic needs. So if you need something and you're hungry, hey, come by. Like, even if it's not a day that the drop-in center is open, we always will give bags of food, and then we'll offer resources. We work collaboratively here in Albuquerque with other youth-serving agencies, and so we're happy to help send those resources to anybody who's out there. We do a lot of outreach looking for young people, and we've got like a flyer we've developed that actually says, here's where the harbor is, so they can come get services, but then also a lot of information about where they can access other services if they're interested with that. So we try to be kind of prolific with that. With our staff, so we have a really experienced staff. We work with people who have been working in behavioral health, homeless services, youth services, in a variety of ways. And that's who we really want there on that, that kind of that ground level with those young people. In fact, right now, one of our staff members is a former foster parent, and not just a foster parent, but he fostered teens, and he fostered teens that were in treatment foster care. So these are really high needs teens, and so he's got a great lived experience with working with young people as well. We've got employees that are former CYFD workers, and so in looking at it, it's hard to find somebody with human trafficking experience because it's such a new field, but finding these related fields is really important for us so that we've got a staff who really understands who we're working with.
Yeah, and I just do want to note that, this is a very prevalent issue. Just a couple months ago, there were a couple folks arrested by APD on Central talking about trafficking a 14-year-old girl. These are stories that are not just, one every few years. I mean, this is stuff that is happening still right now.
And even in looking at that case, there was a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old that were both kind of caught in that trafficking situation by a very violent trafficker. New Mexico Dream Center is part of a couple different task forces. That trafficker was known in the Albuquerque area for being extremely violent and just really, really cruel. These girls were not local girls, but guess what? They were both part of the foster system from the state that they came from. So in looking at that, they were this unhoused youth population who didn't have a lot of resources. And even since then, we've been working on trying to help with Rape Crisis Center, who's been working with them to help get the appropriate resources to them. And where at least one of them is, they don't have something like the harbor that they can just walk up and get resources. And so they're still really, really vulnerable.
And this brings me back to the first, case where you got exposed to human trafficking. How closely do you have to work with law enforcement now in some of these cases to hopefully catch and help stop the perpetrators of human trafficking? Did you have to contact law enforcement when you do learn about cases like this, or even like the the Highland High School student you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So we always try to give tips to law enforcement about different things that get reported to us. And so we'll have people in the community who'll do tips, and they'll be like, hey, I own this business and this is what I'm seeing. And we always try to pass those on, and we encourage them to actually pass on the tip as well. So we always try to do that. When somebody is identified, we have the option and, say, hey, we can help you with a police report, we'll help you with any of these legal kinds of things, but we don't require that. And part of it is we work with young people who might not have that capacity of being able to go, I can't even deal with the police right now. Or we're working with clients who've had a really challenging relationship with law enforcement. And so we let them come into services, and we provide services without them requiring to report. And that's actually something that happens statewide. So we work with an organization called the CVRC. And so CVRC is Crime Victim Compensation. Crime Victim, CVRC.
We'll look it up.
Yeah, I was like, and they are awesome because they provide amazing resources, financial resources for our clients. It used to be for you to be able to make a financial claim, you have to be willing to work with law enforcement. And so they did change that because you do have some people who are just too traumatized or have been abused by law enforcement perhaps, and they're just not able to. That being said, once our clients get a little bit more stable, many of them are like, okay, yeah, I want to testify. I want to pursue charges. But we just kind of tread lightly and carefully, especially at the beginning.
And that is the Crime Victims
Reparations Commission. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no
appreciate
problem.
that. My brain stopped.
It's okay. We know you mentioned a story, as we understand the conversation you had with Carolyn Rush for this Remarkable Women interview. If you can share just how panhandling as well can factor in to this. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we haven't talked about today is actually labor trafficking. And so we see labor trafficking along with sex trafficking. And the story that we had shared with Carolyn was just this really beautiful one because we had been doing outreach on the streets for quite a while. And again, that consistency is huge because relationships are important. And we always pass out, these flyers to the harbor. Well, one day this young guy came up to the harbor and he had his flyer and he's like, so I was told by the lady that I could come here and maybe get some food or something like that. And we're like, absolutely. And so he came for that first day just really quickly, checked us out, made sure we weren't too weird. But then he started coming back every single day that we were open. And so we were able to provide resources for him for those basic necessities. And then to get into the other human trafficking parts of our programming, which does include housing, you have to screen for human trafficking indicators. And so we're like, well, would you like to, see if you screen in for the other programming? He 100% screened in. And so he was a victim of familial trafficking and was surviving by panhandling. And he would take the money back to his parents, who would then purchase drugs. And then there was no food to eat. And he would have to go do this over and over and over again. And so the more he was panhandling, the more other kind of risky behaviors he was having to do to try to get money to support his family, essentially. And so he screened in as a human trafficking victim. He came into our programming, got really connected with one of our volunteers, and then we were able to actually move him into our transitional living housing program. And he graduates here very soon, has a job, has been working in the food service industry, wants to be a chef, and can support himself. And so we were able to walk alongside somebody who was living on the streets, not sure what to do, needed some assistance, and now is able to take care of themselves. And I think that's huge.
How young was this person?
So the first interactions with him were at 17. We started interacting with him at 18. And so I think he's 21 now.
And he's graduating high school?
So no, he's not graduating high school, but he's graduating from our program.
Got it.
So
okay.
he's working on school, but school can be kind of a scary thing too.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
You shared a lot with us today. Is there anything, though, that we're missing that you would like to add or want people to better understand? A specific story that stands out to you?
No, that's probably good. I feel like that's a lot. So, and the big part, which I just really appreciate you letting me talk about, were those models of trafficking, how people come into trafficking, I think is just really important for people to understand.
Yeah, because it is so wide-ranging.
Exactly. It's not just this, oh, this is how you become a trafficking victim. Here's the little door. It's several doors.
Yeah.
So,
well, Shelley Rep, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your knowledge with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here today.
Again, a special thanks to Shelley Rep with the New Mexico Dream Center. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about what they do have a website. It is nmdreamcenter.org. We'll put a link to it as well for the show, and then our post on krqe.com.
Yeah, and you'll hear more about the Dream Center and other remarkable women. If you go to our website on KRQE, there's a whole section for remarkable women, which is really cool to hear stories not only in our community but across the country of movers and shakers in their local communities.
Absolutely. Check out this year's edition. For sure.
If you have any story ideas or people you'd like to hear from on our show, always feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media.
I'm at Chris McKee TV, also chris.mckee@krqe.com. I also say, watch the full episode of this conversation. If you're catching this on Fox New Mexico, you can see the whole thing online, krqe.com/podcast. Thanks for listening and watching.